In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick published The Structure of DNA, the Double Helix, the Code of Life. Humanity celebrated it as one of the greatest discoveries in the history of science. But here's what no one told you. Over 4,000 years before Watson and Crick, before microscopes, before laboratories, before the word genetics existed, a Sumerian scribe pressed these exact words into wet clay. Mix into the clay the blood of a god. Let his spirit be present in the flesh. Let the new being carry the image of the gods, and let that image never be lost, passed from body to body, generation to generation, without end. That is not a prayer. That is a description of hereditary genetic transmission, written in 2500 BC, the ancient city of Nippur, southern Iraq, 1889. American archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania begin excavating what would become the most important literary discovery of the 19th century. They find thousands of clay tablets, a library spanning centuries of Sumerian thought. Among them, a tablet now catalogued simply as CBS 10673, housed today in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Its content a text scholars call Enki and Ninmah. It is one of the oldest creation stories ever written, and when you read it without the filter of mythology, when you read it as a technical document, it describes something that took modern science until the 20th century to understand. Here is what the tablet says, faithfully translated. The gods, the Anunnaki, had created a lower class of divine workers called the Igigi to mine the earth and maintain the land. But the Igigi revolted. They refused to work. So the god Enki, described consistently across all Sumerian texts as the god of wisdom, water, and the Apsu, was tasked with solving the problem. His solution was not a miracle, it was not prayer. Enki devised a plan to create a new being from the clay of the Abs, the deep fresh water, and delegated its execution to his mother Namu, assisted by the goddess Ninmah and 7 helper goddesses. But the method of creation is where it gets deeply strange. A god was put to death, and his body and blood was mixed into the clay. From that combined material, the first human being was created, made in the likeness of the gods. Read that again carefully. Not shaped from clay alone, not spoken into existence. Biological material from an existing being mixed into a base substrate to produce a new one that carries the traits of the original. That is genetic engineering, described in 2500 BC. Let's be precise about what the Sumerians described, and what modern science says, what the tablet says. The new being carries the Teema of the god whose blood was used. The word Teema has been traditionally translated as spirit or personality, but Teema's root components in Sumerian more accurately translate to that which is encoded, the essential information carried within. In 2500 BC, they had no word for DNA, so they used the closest concept available to them, the idea that something invisible, something encoded inside the blood of the Creator, is transferred into the created being and persists across generations. The text specifically states, "That soul in a blood kinship be bound, connecting the spirit directly to biological inheritance, rather than to a supernatural gift." Now compare this to what DNA actually is. DNA is the encoded information carried within the nucleus of every cell. It is passed from parent to offspring. It determines physical traits, biological function, and inherited characteristics. It does not change between generations unless deliberately altered. The Sumerians described a substance inside blood that carries the characteristics of the source being, that is transferred during biological creation, that persists from generation to generation. They called it Teema, we call it DNA. Different word, same concept. 4,500-year gap. The Enki and Ninmah tablet is not alone. There is a second text, arguably even more specific, called the Atrahasis epic. Written approximately 1700 BC in Akkadian, it is a more detailed account of the same creation event. In Atrahasis, Enki and the goddess Mamu create man, called Lulu, by mixing the flesh and blood of a lesser god into clay, producing the first human being capable of bearing labor. But the Atrahasis goes further than Enki and Ninmah in one critical way. It describes the process in procedural steps. Step 1. A divine being is selected as the genetic source. Step 2. Its biological material, specifically blood, described as containing the Teema, is extracted. Step 3. This material is combined with clay, the base material, representing the existing hominid biological structure. Step 4. The combination is placed in a birth chamber, presided over by 7 specialist goddesses called the Sasharatu, described as those who nip off pieces and place them in wombs. 7 specialist goddesses, presiding over a biological incubation process, each handling a separate specimen. These 7 birth goddesses are described as nipping off pieces of the clay and placing them in wombs, a procedural description that maps directly to what we would now call in vitro fertilization or embryo implantation. Modern IVF was developed in 1978. The Sumerians described the same process before 1700 BC. Now, here is where the ancient text meets a modern scientific puzzle that has no clean answer. In the human genome, approximately 97% of our DNA does not code for proteins. Scientists initially called it junk DNA, a term they have since abandoned because it turned out not to be junk at all. It contains regulatory sequences, non-coding RNA, and complex functions we are still mapping. But what's more interesting is the specific question of human evolutionary speed. The gap between our nearest genetic relative, the chimpanzee, and modern Homo sapiens is approximately 1.2% of the genome. That sounds small, but in evolutionary terms, it represents changes that should have taken millions of years to develop through natural selection. The fossil record shows they occurred in a fraction of that time. Evolutionary biologists have several explanations for this, but there is a minority scientific position, held by credentialed researchers, that the speed of human cognitive and biological development is statistically unusual. Recent breakthroughs in genomics, evolutionary biology, and paleogenetics are revealing patterns in human DNA that suggest our origins may be far more complex than previously believed. The Sumerians didn't need a genome sequencer to notice the same thing. They simply recorded what they believed had happened, and they recorded it in procedural technical language, not the language of myth, the language of someone describing a process they had witnessed. Here is what we know for certain. The Sumerian tablet known as Enki and Ninmah, housed today in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the creation of a human being through the mixing of divine biological material with an existing base organism. It uses the word Teema to describe what is transferred, a word that means encoded information carried within, and states explicitly that this information passes from generation to generation without loss. Watson and Crick described the same mechanism in 1953. They called it the double helix. They won the Nobel Prize. The Sumerian scribe who first wrote this concept down pressed it into clay somewhere around 2500 BC. He didn't get a prize. His tablet sat in a museum basement for over 100 years before anyone read it carefully enough to ask the right question. How did he know? He had no microscope, no laboratory, no electron crystallography. But he described hereditary genetic transmission with a precision that the entire Western scientific tradition didn't reach until the middle of the 20th century. Either he was extraordinarily lucky with a metaphor, or he wasn't guessing at all. Subscribe, because next week we look at the Sumerian tablet that describes a global extinction event. The date it gives corresponds to something real that scientists found in the ice core record. And it's not the flood.